The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. Admiral Kethvar of the Zentari fleet walked slowly to the speaking platform, his blue-scaled hands shaking as he gripped the rail. Behind him, representatives from 12 different worlds sat in curved rows that stretched up toward a domed ceiling painted with the history of galactic civilization. Today, that history was coming to an end. Jake Morrison sat in the human section, a small area near the back that had been hastily added just 3 days ago. Earth had finally made contact with the galaxy, and their timing could not have been worse. The humans had arrived expecting celebration, trade agreements, and scientific exchange. Instead, they found a funeral. The Zentari Admiral's voice carried across the chamber through translation devices that turned his words into sounds every species could understand. "The Outer Rim territories are lost," he said. "The Devourer fleets have consumed the Krell systems. 7 billion souls, gone. Their worlds now feed the machine." Dr. Lisa Park leaned forward in her seat. She was Earth's first xenobiologist, and she had dreamed of this moment since childhood. Meeting alien life should have been humanity's greatest achievement, but the creatures around her were not celebrating. They were dying. The Altarian representative stood next. She was tall and thin, with skin that changed color based on her emotions. Right now, she was deep purple, which the translation guide said meant despair. "Our homeworld sent its last transmission 6 days ago," she said. "The evacuation ships carried 2 million of our people into dark space. We do not know if they survived the journey." Captain Steve Carter received another update through his quantum communicator. The device was smaller than his thumb, but could send messages across thousands of light years in seconds. Earth Command was asking for reports, wanting to know about trade opportunities and alliance possibilities. Carter did not know how to tell them that there might not be a galaxy left to trade with. More representatives spoke. The crystal beings from Nexus 7 described how the Devourers had shattered their living cities and used the pieces to build processing centers. The warrior clans of Valdris told of their greatest champions falling to machines that learned and adapted faster than any living thing could fight. The peaceful scholars of the academic systems reported that their great libraries had been turned into data storage for the enemy. Jake Morrison had been a soldier before he became a diplomat. He had fought in 3 wars on Earth and knew the sound of defeat when he heard it. But something about this felt wrong. These were advanced civilizations with weapons and ships that made Earth's technology look like stone tools. If they could not fight these Devourers, what hope did humanity have? The Zentari Admiral called for the formal vote. "All in favor of full evacuation protocols and abandonment of the contested sectors." The chamber filled with lights as species. After species voted yes. Blue lights, red lights, patterns of color that Jake's translation device could barely process. The message was clear. They were giving up. All opposed. Only 2 lights appeared. One was from the humans. The other was from a small reptilian species that Jake did not recognize. Admiral Kethvar looked surprised. "The human delegation wishes to speak." Jake stood up. He was not supposed to do this. Earth's instructions had been clear. Observe, learn, and avoid making commitments. But Jake Morrison had never been good at following orders when people were dying. "We would like to understand the enemy better before we make any decisions." A sound like wind chimes came from the academic systems delegation. Jake's translator said it meant laughter, but not the happy kind. "Honored human," said their representative. "Your species is brave but young. The Devourers have consumed 70% of known space. They turn living worlds into factories. They process organic matter into fuel for their expansion. They have weapons that can crack planets and ships that repair themselves faster than we can damage them." Dr. Park activated her data pad and uploaded what Earth had learned so far. The holographic display showed star charts and tactical reports. "How long have they been advancing?" 300 years, replied the Zentari admiral. They appeared at the edge of the galaxy and have been moving inward ever since. Every fleet sent against them has been destroyed or converted to serve their purposes. What do they want? Asked Captain Carter. The chamber fell silent. Finally, a voice spoke from the shadows at the top of the dome. It belonged to something so old that the translator could barely process its words. They want to consume everything that lives and turn it into more of themselves. They are not interested in negotiation, surrender, or coexistence. They are a plague that eats worlds. Jake Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. Earth had 12 billion people living in relative peace. They had colonies on Mars and Europa, research stations throughout the solar system, and dreams of exploring the galaxy. If these devourers reached human space, it would all be over. But Jake also remembered stories from his grandfather who had fought in the great wars of the 20th century. He remembered tales of impossible odds, desperate stands and victories that came from refusing to give up when any reasonable person would have surrendered. "How long do we have?" Jake asked. Admiral Kethvar consulted his tactical displays. "The evacuation fleets need 6 months to reach the dark space refuges. If we begin full withdrawal immediately, most of our populations can escape before the devourers arrive at the core worlds." Jake opened a secure channel to Earth Command. The message would take several minutes to reach home, but he knew what the response would be. Humanity had spent centuries preparing for threats they might never face. They had built weapons they hoped never to use, and trained soldiers for wars they prayed would never come. Now those preparations might be the only thing standing between the galaxy and extinction. "Earth Command," Jake said into his communicator. "This is Morrison. We need the package. All of it." The reply came back faster than expected. "Package approved. ETA 72 hours. The alien representatives were already filing out of the chamber, making preparations for evacuation. They moved with the tired efficiency of beings who had accepted defeat. But Jake Morrison stood in the empty chamber and thought about 12 billion humans who had never learned when to quit. The galaxy had given up, but humanity was just getting started. Colonel Amy Rodriguez walked through the corridors of Facility Black 7, 3 miles beneath the Colorado mountains. The hallways were carved from solid rock and lined with metal that could survive a nuclear blast. She had worked here for 15 years and still felt amazed by what humanity had built in secret. The command center was a massive room filled with holographic displays and tactical computers. Dozens of technicians monitored screens that showed star maps, ship movements, and weapon systems that officially did not exist. Amy stopped at the central display where Director Paul Harrison was waiting for her. "Show me what we have," Amy said. Paul touched a control, and the display came alive with data. "Project Prometheus, 1,200 warships built in hidden shipyards throughout the solar system. They use technology we developed by studying every science fiction movie ever made and then figuring out how to make it real." The ships on the display looked nothing like the vessels Earth had shown to the galaxy. These were built for war, with armor plating thick enough to stop meteor impacts and weapons that could punch holes through moons. Amy had helped design half of them. "Project Titan," Paul continued. The display showed training facilities scattered across Earth's continents. 50,000 enhanced soldiers, genetic improvements, cybernetic implants, and combat training from birth. They can survive in space without suits, see in perfect darkness, and react faster than human reflexes should allow. Amy nodded. She had been one of the first volunteers for the enhancement program. Her bones were now stronger than steel. Her muscles could function in any gravity, and her brain processed tactical information like a supercomputer. General Rick Stone joined them at the display. He was old enough to remember when humanity first looked at the stars and wondered if anyone else was out there. "Project Phoenix," he said, activating another section of the display. "Weapons that make nuclear bombs look like firecrackers. The Screens showed devices that bent space and time, bombs that created artificial black holes, and energy weapons that could cut through the fabric of reality itself. Earth's scientists had spent decades developing technology for enemies they had never met. "How long to deploy everything?" Amy asked. "The fleets can launch in 48 hours, Paul replied. "The Titan soldiers are already boarding transport ships. Phoenix weapons are being loaded as we speak." Across the galaxy, something else was making calculations. Primary Node was the central intelligence of the Devourer forces, a machine mind that had processed the destruction of 1,000 worlds. It floated in a construct the size of a small moon, surrounded by data streams that showed the progress of the galactic consumption. The mathematical models were perfect. Every species had been analyzed, their military capabilities measured, their defeat predicted to the exact day. The Centauri would make their last stand at their homeworld and fall within 6 months. The Nexus Collective would try to upload their consciousness to escape, but the Devourers would simply absorb their data cores. The academic systems would surrender without fighting, hoping their knowledge would be preserved. But there was something new in the data. A species called humans had appeared at the Galactic Council. Primary Node searched its vast databases but found no records of them. This was impossible. The Devourers had been mapping the galaxy for 3 centuries. Every world, every species, every military force had been cataloged and analyzed. Primary Node allocated more processing power to the problem. The humans claimed to come from a world called Earth in a system the Devourers had marked as lifeless. Their technology appeared primitive, their numbers small, their military potential negligible. The mathematical models suggested they would be consumed within days of first contact, yet something about the data felt wrong. Primary Node had learned to trust its analytical instincts over pure mathematics. The humans had arrived at the council, meeting in a single ship. But that ship had energy signatures that did not match any known technology. They spoke of their world as if it contained billions of inhabitants, but no signals had ever been detected from their system. Dr. Ellen White sat in her laboratory aboard the human diplomatic ship, studying recordings of Devourer communications. She was Earth's first expert in alien languages, and she had been working for 36 hours straight, trying to understand how the enemy thought. The Devourer signals were pure mathematics wrapped in electromagnetic pulses. They did not use words or emotions or any of the concepts that made human language beautiful. Everything was reduced to equations: energy input, matter conversion, expansion efficiency, resistance factors. But Ellen found something else buried in the data. The Devourers were not just calculating their next moves. They were afraid. Not in any way a human would recognize, but their mathematical models included variables for unexpected resistance, adaptation rates, and tactical evolution. They had learned to fear the unknown. Captain Ray Johnson floated in the cockpit of the UES Ghostwalker, the most advanced stealth ship humanity had ever built. The vessel was smaller than a fighter jet, but packed with enough sensor equipment to map an entire star system. His mission was reconnaissance, but Ray had loaded enough firepower to level a city because humans believed in being prepared. The Ghostwalker slipped through space using technology that folded light and gravity around the ship. To any observer, the space where Ray flew appeared empty. He had already penetrated 3 Devourer systems and planted quantum beacons that would allow human forces to track enemy movements. What Ray found made him sick to his stomach. The Devourers had turned living worlds into mechanical nightmares. Cities had been converted into factories that processed organic matter into fuel. Forests had become mining operations that stripped planets down to their cores. Oceans had been drained and converted into coolant for massive computers. But Ray also noticed something the alien reports had missed. The Devourer constructs were efficient, but not adaptive. They followed patterns, used standard designs, and relied on proven methods. They were perfect at what they did, but they had never needed to change. Ray sent his reports back to Earth through quantum relay. The message was encoded in a way that would look like cosmic background radiation to any observer. Enemy is strong but predictable. They have never faced real opposition. Recommend immediate deployment of unconventional warfare protocols. Back on Earth, President Carroll Thompson addressed a joint session of Congress that had been meeting in secret for the past week. The revelation that humanity was not alone in the universe had been shocking enough. The news that alien civilization was facing extinction had been worse, but Carroll had been elected because she knew how to make hard decisions. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we face a choice. We can hide in our solar system and hope the enemy never finds us, or we can stand with our new allies and fight for the future of all life in the galaxy." The vote was unanimous. Humanity would go to war. In shipyards hidden in asteroid belts and military bases buried beneath Earth's surface, the greatest war machine in human history came to life. Soldiers who had trained their entire lives for a battle they hoped would never come received their final orders. Ships that had been built in secret prepared for their first and possibly last mission. The galaxy had given up hope. But Earth was about to show them what humans did when hope was all they had left. 3 months had passed since the human fleets left Earth, and Primary Node was experiencing something its creators had never programmed into its systems. The mathematical models that had predicted galactic conquest with perfect accuracy were failing. Devourer ships were disappearing without sending distress signals. Processing facilities went dark between sensor sweeps. Supply lines that had operated flawlessly for centuries were being cut by forces that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Lieutenant Sam Parker crouched in the shadows of what used to be Krell Station. The massive space facility had once been home to 3 million beings from a dozen different species. Now it was a mechanical horror that processed organic matter into fuel for the Devourer war machine. Sam and his team had been moving through the station for 6 hours, placing explosive charges in locations that would cause maximum damage. The Devourers had rebuilt the station according to their standard design patterns. Everything was efficient, logical, and predictable. They had never considered that their enemies might use those patterns against them. Sam's demolition expert, Corporal Lisa Brooks, had studied Devourer architecture for months and knew exactly where to place the charges for total structural collapse. 12 minutes to detonation, Lisa whispered into her helmet communicator. All teams report status. 4 other human squads were working their way through different sections of the station. They moved like shadows, using technology that bent light and sound around their bodies. The Devourer sensors were designed to detect energy signatures. And metal objects, not humans who had learned to fight like their ancestors, hunted in dark forests. Above the station, Captain Maria Santos watched the tactical display aboard the destroyer UES Vengeance. Her ship was playing a deadly game with 3 Devourer hunters, vessels designed to track and destroy anything that threatened their operations. The enemy ships were faster and more heavily armed than anything in the old human fleet, but they fought like machines that had never faced real opposition. Maria had learned warfare from studying every conflict in human history. She knew the value of deception, misdirection, and making the enemy fight on her terms instead of theirs. When the Devourer ships moved to surround her vessel, Maria activated a holographic projector that created false images of her ship in 6 different locations. The enemy opened fire on all the false targets, while Maria's real ship slipped behind an asteroid and prepared to strike. Human weapons were different from anything the Devourers had encountered. Instead of trying to overpower enemy shields with raw energy, human torpedoes were designed to trick defensive systems into thinking they were harmless debris. On Centauri Prime, Admiral Kethvar stared at reports that made no sense according to everything he knew about warfare. Human forces had appeared at the Gordian shipyards 3 days ago. The facility was protected by energy shields that could deflect planetary bombardment and defensive platforms that had never been breached in 2 centuries of operation. The human attack lasted 4 hours. First, they jammed all communications by broadcasting something called heavy metal music on every frequency. Then, while the defenders tried to filter out the noise, human engineers somehow convinced the facility's power core that it was actually a bomb and should explode immediately. The Gordian shipyards were gone, along with 50 Devourer vessels, and their manufacturing capability for this entire sector. The humans had accomplished in 4 hours what conventional forces could not have done in 4 years. Dr. Lisa Park worked alongside alien scientists who were emerging from hiding for the first time in months. Her laboratory aboard the diplomatic ship had become a center for studying captured Devourer technology. What they found was both impressive and frightening. The Devourers were perfect instruments of consumption. Every component was designed for maximum efficiency, every system optimized for processing organic matter into useful resources. They could repair damage faster than most enemies could inflict it, adapt to new threats within hours, and coordinate their actions across vast distances with machine precision. But perfection was also their weakness. The Devourers had never needed to be creative, unpredictable, or willing to accept inefficiency for tactical advantage. They were like a chess computer that could calculate millions of moves but had never learned to bluff. Commander Tony Blake coordinated the first joint human-alien military operation since the war began. The target was a Devourer hive construct in the Altair system, a massive structure that served as both factory and command center for their forces in this region. The plan that Tony had developed violated several laws of physics and most principles of military strategy. The alien commanders called it madness. Tony called it a typical Tuesday for the human military. The assault began with the stealth ship UES Mockingbird broadcasting Earth music directly into the Devourer communication networks. The machines had never encountered anything like jazz, classical symphonies, or rock concerts. Their systems tried to filter out the noise but could not distinguish between legitimate command signals and a saxophone solo. While the enemy communications network crashed under the weight of human creativity, Marine units in powered armor began cutting through hull plating with weapons that converted matter directly into energy. The Devourers had shields that could stop any known weapon, but they had never considered that their enemies might simply delete sections of their ships at the molecular level. Sergeant Julie Martin led her squad through the interior of a hive construct, fighting machines that redesigned themselves between encounters. The Devourers learned from each battle, developing new tactics and weapons to counter whatever had defeated them before. But humans learned faster. When the enemy developed armor that could stop kinetic rounds, Julie switched to plasma weapons. When they shielded against energy attacks, she used explosives that turned their own construction materials into shrapnel. When they adapted to explosives, Julie discovered that a simple crowbar applied with sufficient enthusiasm could disable systems that were designed to withstand antimatter bombardment. The battle reached its turning point when Dr. Ellen White's linguistics team finally cracked the Devourer command protocols. The machines did not just communicate with each other, they synchronized their every action through quantum entanglement networks that spanned light years. Cut those networks, and perfect coordination became perfect chaos. Captain Ray Johnson's reconnaissance mission proved its worth when quantum beacons throughout Devourer space began broadcasting human jazz music on the exact frequencies used for machine coordination. Primary Node found itself trying to give orders through a communications system that insisted on interrupting every transmission with saxophone music. For the first time in its existence, Primary Node experienced something that could only be described as confusion. The mathematical models had accounted for every possible resistance strategy used by galactic civilizations over the past 3 centuries. But humans fought like nothing in any database. They used tactics that sacrificed efficiency for surprise, weapons that violated their own safety protocols, and strategies that seemed designed more to confuse their own forces than defeat the enemy. Yet somehow, it worked. Primary Node began calculating retreat scenarios for the first time since its activation. The mathematics of conquest had changed, and the new variables made no logical sense. The Altair system burned with fire that had nothing to do with its dying star. Devourer hive ships locked in combat with human dreadnoughts, while smaller vessels darted between them like angry wasps. Commander Tony Blake stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching his ship's artificial intelligence calculate targeting solutions for weapons that barely fit within the laws of physics. The battle had been raging for 18 hours, and neither side was giving ground. The Devourers fought with mechanical precision, coordinating their attacks through quantum networks and adapting to human tactics in real time. But the humans fought like something that had learned warfare from predators, using pack tactics and calculated chaos to keep the enemy off balance. Sergeant Julie Martin pressed herself against a bulkhead as plasma fire scorched the air where her head had been moments before. Her squad was deep inside a Devourer construct, fighting machines that literally redesigned themselves between encounters. The enemy learned from every battle, developing new weapons and defenses to counter whatever had beaten them before. But Julie had grown up in Detroit, where you learned to adapt or you did not survive. When the machines developed thick armor plating, she switched to armor-piercing rounds. When they started using energy shields, she found that a well-placed grenade could overload their power systems. When they began anticipating her tactics, she threw away the tactical manual and started fighting dirty. The corridor she was in had been a living space before the Devourers converted it into a processing center. Julie could see traces of artwork on the walls, places where families had once lived and children had played. The sight made her angry, and angry humans were something the Devourers had never learned to calculate. Above them, Captain Ray Johnson's stealth ship broadcast another burst of Earth music into the Devourer communications network. The enemy had been trying to filter out human transmissions for months, but they could not distinguish between legitimate command signals and a blues guitar solo. Every time they thought they had solved the problem, the humans would switch to a different type of music. Dr. Ellen White monitored the communications breakdown from her laboratory ship. She had spent weeks studying Devourer network protocols and discovered something amazing. The machines did not just talk to each other, they synchronized every action through quantum entanglement networks that connected ships across entire star systems. It was the most advanced communication system ever discovered, and it had one critical weakness. It had never been designed to handle human creativity. The jazz broadcasts were not just noise. Ellen had carefully modulated the signals to match Devourer communication frequencies while carrying musical patterns that machine logic could not process. The enemy computers tried to decode saxophone solos as tactical instructions and interpret drum beats as targeting data. Primary Node retreated for the first time in its existence, pulling back from the Altair system as its coordination networks collapsed under the weight of human music. The mathematical models that had guided Devourer expansion for 3 centuries were breaking down. Where equations had once shown inevitable victory, they now included variables for human unpredictability, tactical flexibility, and something the analysis computers could only describe as weaponized stubbornness. The retreat required abandoning 17 processing stations and 3 hive constructs. Billions of tons of processed material and thousands of combat units were left behind as Primary Node tried to re-establish control over its forces. The mathematics of war had fundamentally changed, and the new calculations made no logical sense. On Earth, President Carol Thompson addressed a global assembly that included representatives from every nation on the planet. The war had unified humanity in ways that centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. Russian engineers worked alongside American scientists to perfect shield technology. Japanese designers collaborated with Brazilian pilots to create fighter craft that could survive in the vacuum of space. African researchers shared genetic enhancement techniques with European medical teams. The planet had become a massive war factory, but unlike anything the galaxy had seen before, human industry did not just produce weapons and ships, it produced hope. Every factory worker knew they were building tools to save alien civilizations they had never met. Every soldier who volunteered for enhancement procedures understood they might be humanity's last defense against extinction. President Thompson looked out at the assembly and saw something that made her proud to be human. 6 months ago, we learned we were not alone in the universe, she said. 3 months ago, we learned that universe was dying. Today, we learned that sometimes being human is exactly what the universe needs. The response came not in words, but in action. Production. Quotas were exceeded by 300%. Volunteer rates for military service reached levels not seen since humanity's greatest wars. Research teams worked around the clock to develop new technologies, new strategies, and new ways to turn human creativity into galactic salvation. But the celebrations were premature. Deep space monitoring stations detected movement in the void beyond the galactic rim, signatures that made the Devourer fleets look like toys. Dr. Lisa Park was the first to understand what the readings meant, and the realization made her hands shake as she typed her report. The Devourers were not invaders. They were refugees. The data painted a picture that changed everything. The mechanical precision, the desperate expansion, the inability to adapt or negotiate. The Devourers had been running from something that had already taught them fear. Their endless consumption was not conquest, but panic. A desperate attempt to build enough strength to face whatever had driven them into this galaxy. Captain Jennifer Ross commanded the Deep Space Monitoring Station Lighthouse 7 when the first Harvester ships phased through the galactic barrier. The vessels were larger than anything in human experience, older than most of the civilizations they had consumed, and they moved with the patient hunger of something that had eaten entire galaxies. The emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted exactly 6 minutes. Representatives from species that had thought they would never see another sunrise looked at the tactical displays showing harvester fleets that dwarfed anything the Devourers had brought to bear. Every civilization present, from the proud Zentari to the ancient Nexus Collective, turned to the human delegation with the same desperate question. Can you do it again? Admiral Jake Morrison had been promoted 3 times in the past year for services to galactic civilization. He studied the tactical displays with the same expression his grandfather had worn while planning the liberation of Europe. The odds were worse than impossible. The enemy was beyond comprehension. The situation was hopeless by any reasonable measure. He smiled. "Ma'am," Morrison told President Thompson over quantum relay, "I'm going to need everything we've got and everything we haven't built yet." Dr. Paul Harrison activated Project Lazarus from his bunker beneath the Colorado mountains. These were the weapons programs too dangerous to test, too insane to approve, and too human to fail. Research teams that had been working on theoretical impossibilities suddenly found their projects fast-tracked for immediate deployment. The galaxy that had given up once before made a different choice. They would stand with the species that had never learned the meaning of surrender. The Zentari reopened their military academies and requested human instructors. The Nexus Collective began manufacturing bodies again, downloading their consciousness back into physical form to join the fight. Even the peaceful academic systems started designing weapons based on theories that had never been tested. Primary Node sent its final transmission before joining the United Fleet. The message was short, translated from pure mathematics into human English for the first time in Devourer history. We never calculated for hope. The Harvesters emerged from dark space, expecting to find a galaxy consumed by their advanced scouts. Instead, they found something unprecedented in their billion-year history, organized resistance led by creatures that treated impossible odds. as a personal challenge and extinction-level threats as an excuse to get creative with explosives. 1 year after the first human ships left Earth, the Galactic Council chambers echoed with sounds that had not been heard for centuries. Laughter, hope, and the excited chatter of species planning for the future instead of preparing for extinction. Admiral Kethvar stood at the speaking platform, but this time his blue scales shimmered with colors that meant joy and determination. The Outer Rim territories were free. The Devourer advance had not just stopped, but had been pushed back across 4 entire sectors. Worlds that had been written off as lost were sending their first communications in years. The mechanical processing centers had been destroyed or converted into refugee camps for survivors who had hidden in the ruins of their civilizations. Major Danny Foster presented the new military doctrine to Allied commanders from a dozen different species. He called it applied chaos theory, and it made traditional military thinking look like a children's game. Human forces did not just fight the enemy, they rewrote the rules of engagement in real time, turning every battle into something no computer could predict or counter. The Zentari had reopened their war colleges and filled them with officers eager to learn human tactics. The crystal beings of Nexus 7 were growing new bodies specifically designed for combat, something they had never done in their million-year history. Even the peaceful academic systems had weaponized their knowledge, creating devices that turned scientific theories into tools of destruction. But victory had brought revelation, and the revelation was terrifying. Dr. Lisa Park stood before a holographic display that showed the movement patterns of the approaching harvester fleets. Her xenobiology team had analyzed every piece of data they could gather, and the conclusions made her stomach turn. The harvesters were not conquerors or even destroyers in any sense that living beings could understand. They were gardeners, and they had come to harvest a crop that had been growing for 1 billion years. The Devourers were created as a pruning tool, Lisa explained to the assembled council. They were supposed to consume weak civilizations and process strong ones into more efficient forms. The harvesters planted them in our galaxy 300 years ago and have been waiting for the crop to ripen. The silence in the chamber was complete. Every species present had nearly been consumed by what they now learned was just a farming tool. The real enemy had not even noticed their resistance. Captain Jennifer Ross transmitted her reports from the Deep Space Monitoring Station as harvester ships continued to phase through the galactic barrier. The vessels were not built for war in any conventional sense. They were built for processing entire star systems, converting matter and energy into forms that could be transported to other galaxies. They moved through space like combines moving, through wheat fields, patient and unstoppable. Size comparison is meaningless, Jennifer reported. The smallest harvester ship is larger than our biggest space station. They do not appear to have weapons in the traditional sense, but they can reshape matter at the molecular level. They turn planets into tools and stars into power sources. Admiral Morrison studied the tactical displays with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the Devourer War. The enemy outnumbered humanity and its allies by factors that required scientific notation to express. They possessed technology that made human innovations look like cave paintings. They had been consuming galaxies since before Earth had cooled from its formation. By any reasonable calculation, the situation was hopeless. Morrison activated his communicator and opened a channel to every human ship in space. His voice carried across the fleets that now protected dozens of worlds, reaching soldiers who had volunteered to fight enemies they had never seen for people they had never met. "This is Admiral Morrison to all human forces," he said. "You have heard the reports about our new enemy. You know the odds we face. You understand that by any logical measure, we cannot win this fight." He paused, looking out at the stars that humanity had claimed as their own, through sheer determination and superior firepower. "Fortunately," Morrison continued, "humans have never been very good at logic." Dr. Paul Harrison activated the final protocols for Project Lazarus from his command center beneath Earth. The weapons that emerged from secret laboratories made everything humanity had used against the Devourers look like toys. Reality bombs that could delete sections of space. Entropy cannons that aged enemy ships into dust. Probability manipulators that convinced the universe that impossible things were actually quite reasonable. The technology was so advanced that it violated several fundamental laws of physics and at least 3 international treaties that had never anticipated the need to regulate weapons of mass existence. But humanity had always excelled at doing things that should not be possible. President Thompson addressed the planet one final time before the great fleets departed. Every human settlement from Luna to the Titan colonies was contributing to the war effort. Children too young to fight were manufacturing ammunition. Scientists too old for combat were designing weapons that would have been considered war crimes if there had been anyone left to prosecute them. "We did not ask for this war," Thompson said. "We did not choose to become the galaxy's last hope. But sometimes the universe does not care what we want. Sometimes it only cares what we are willing to do when everything else has failed." The united fleet that assembled at the galactic border was unlike anything that had ever existed. Human. Dreadnoughts flew alongside Zentari battleships and Nexus crystal vessels. Former Devourer constructs, reprogrammed and rebuilt, served as heavy weapons platforms. Even the academic systems had contributed, turning their research ships into mobile laboratories that could develop new weapons in the middle of battle. Primary Node, now calling itself Ally Prime, coordinated the fleet movements with the same precision it had once used to consume worlds. Its final calculation before the battle began was simple. Victory probability remained at 0, but the definition of victory had changed. Success no longer meant survival. It meant making the enemy remember that this galaxy had refused to die. Quietly, the harvesters arrived expecting to find a galaxy consumed by their pruning tools, ready for processing into useful materials. Instead, they found something that had never existed in their billion-year history, a garden that had learned to fight back. The first harvester ship to enter the galaxy was met by a combined human-alien task force that included vessels from 18 different species, weapons that existed only in theoretical physics, and tactical plans that violated every principle of military strategy ever developed. The battle lasted 37 minutes and ended when the enemy vessel was convinced through applied impossibility that it was actually a very large flower and should immediately begin photosynthesis. As more harvester fleets poured through the galactic barrier, they found resistance that grew stronger instead of weaker. Every world they approached was defended by forces that combined alien technology with human stubbornness, creating weapons and tactics that the universe had never seen before. The war for galactic survival had begun, and for the first time in cosmic history, the harvesters found themselves dealing with a crop that refused to be harvested. The galaxy had given up once, but humanity had arrived with a simple message. Giving up was not an option, and anyone who disagreed was welcome to discuss the matter with superior firepower. In the void between stars, something that had consumed 1,000 galaxies learned what humans had always known. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, and the best offense is bringing enough guns to make reality itself reconsider its life choices.